Hey, everybody. Everyone doing well? For those that I can see, thumbs up. All right. Well, we have made it to our final virtual session. And so tonight we are going to focus on bringing everything together from our previous sessions and focusing more on the production side of urban agriculture. And we're going to finish up the second half of tonight with a session on agroforestry, urban agroforestry, with our colleague Catherine, who is here from our California office, NCAT's California office. And so before we get started, oh, and I should mention too, once Catherine is done, I want to finish up with just a couple comments regarding our trip to Baltimore. And then as a reminder too, we will have a link to a survey for tonight's session as well. And a couple other sort of logistical components. But before we get started, first of all, everyone, happy fall. And as a reminder, this session, as with all of them, is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Session 4 folder in Teachable. And we plan to have all this information available and for you all to have access for the foreseeable future. And so unless we find out something with Teachable, we will let you know, but and then transition it to somewhere else where you'll have access to it. But you should continue to have access to all of the resources that have been uploaded to the site, including all of the recordings. So before we dive in, just want to ask to see if there's any questions regarding logistics, access to Teachable, any questions from last week's session, any questions regarding some of the marketing sheets that Tammy provided, and or from any of the previous sessions as well. Feel free to unmute yourselves and also use the chat. All right, well, if there's no questions, we're going to get started. And tonight I believe there are no breakout groups. So you can sit back, relax, and again, just don't hesitate to unmute yourselves or use the chat to ask questions throughout the presentations. And as always, Ray, Emily, Margot, and I, and now Catherine, are available for any questions you may have regarding technical assistance related to urban agriculture. And you can also reach out to Robin and Carlos for any questions regarding the resources and materials, access to the website, Teachable, anything like that. So if everyone's ready, we're going to start with, I'm going to give a presentation on urban farming, more with a focus on production, but also my goal is to sort of tie together all of the previous sessions. So things we've learned from Rusty within the legal components of starting and managing an urban farm, marketing a little bit. I know there were some questions last week Tammy wanted me to follow up on, and also a few things on land access for an urban farm, and sort of tying it all together with this idea of going back to the importance of having a whole farm business plan and understanding your financials to help you make decisions for managing your farm. So I'm going to start with, oh, and I also want to mention that I've sort of put this presentation together in a sense to, one, showcase a lot of things you may see on the farms in Baltimore, as well as to get you starting to think about some questions you may want to ask some of the farmers that popped up throughout these sessions and within your work so far within starting or managing your urban farm. But it's really sort of, again, to bring it all together, but also to help lead into our experience in Baltimore over the 2 days, which as of today, we have 6 farms we'll be visiting in the 2 days. It's going to be a whirlwind tour. But yeah, I'll explain more about that in a little bit. So just looking at this opening slide, this the farm and both pictures are from the Armed to Urban Farm training we did in Cleveland in 2000 and I believe that was 19. So yeah, and getting started, before we go to the next slide, Carlos, I want to show a video sort of about access to land. Doesn't specifically target urban agriculture, but I think it really points out 4 big components that not only we're going to discuss tonight, but that Rusty really focused on in terms of zoning and other considerations as you scope out a site. The video is from Michael Kilpatrick, who is a farmer in Ohio. He's also a consultant and has a for-profit consulting business that he also does courses with. I've known Michael a long time. He and his brother started their own farm in high school in New York and farmed for 10 years before Michael decided to move to Ohio to be closer to his wife's family. And so he consulted for a few years before, as he looked for the land he was looking for to help manage towards his goals. And so this is his, I believe, first year back in production in Ohio. But I think he points out 4 really critical components that I think really help allow us to dive into what I want to focus on this evening. So Carlos, feel free to take it away.
Hey there, Michael here with Growing Farmers and the Farm on Central. And today we're going to talk about the 4 most important things to find the right piece of property so that you don't go bankrupt. And I say that because I actually have seen farms go bankrupt because they were on the wrong piece of property, and either they didn't have any water and the crops burned up, or they were in the wrong political climate and the zoning or the regulation got them, or they had the wrong type of soil. And I've seen this multiple times. We actually had a farm in upstate New York that farmed very well. They were very well known for their greens, but they were heavy clay soil, and that put them out of business. So let's talk through the 4 things, and then we will dive into each one individually. So the first one is gonna be soil, second is gonna be water, third one is gonna be location, and 4th one is going to probably be political climate. And again, that's not necessarily, let's say, red versus blue. It's more of, are you in this town? Are you in the township? Are you, what are the regulations in your county? Do you have protections under agricultural? So first is we're going to talk soil. So here you can go see here, this is a lettuce succession. Now, previously, we had our strawberries here. So this has strawberries earlier in the year, and we can find a few crowns here someplace probably. I don't see any crowns. What I do see is some of our biotelloplastic, which is starting to break right down. You can see this was tilled under this spring, and literally by the time we tilled this lettuce under, it will be completely broken down into the soil. But let's take a look at the soil here. Look at that quality of that. It's a very sandy loam. You can see the sand particles in there. We are desperately adding as much organic matter possible to it because we need that organic matter to hold the moisture in it. But we picked this soil, even though we knew it was sandy, because I would much rather have sandy soil and irrigate than have wet soil and not being able to plant. So literally 24 hours after a rain, we can come back out, mark beds, plant, we're completely fine. I know some farmers that's 10 days. And if you're doing rapid turn greens, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to keep up with your successions. And customers want lettuce every single week, not, a few weeks here and a few weeks there. So you want to make sure that your soil is right. The second thing we talk about is water. Now, water here, because we have such dry soil, is so important. And right now we're actually operating on only 20 gallons a minute. Actually, our well is 10 gallons a minute. My sister-in-law who lives next door is 10 gallons a minute. We steal her water. But between that, we have 20 gallons a minute, which means we can pretty much cover the farm twice through every single week and put about 1 inch of water on that. So you can see here, we've got a small micro irrigation. And it works for our size. We're planting 100-foot beds. We're doing about 8 blocks at a time, 8-bed blocks at a time, and that works really well. And we have our lead lines hooked onto quick connects, so we're quick connecting onto those and just moving through the farm. So that's the second thing, is going to be your water. Now, let's go take a look at location, because that is key. Okay, so we talked about location, how important that is. And here we are. Our farm is on a 12,000 car a day road. And so that drives incredible traffic. And we've chosen to do an on-farm retail store, which has worked out really well for us. So we open 6 days a week, and we have it set up mostly self-service. So people come on, shop, enter their information into our kiosk, and away they go. And so obviously a nice thing about being next to this road is we can put our sign out. It has our website on it. We have changeable letters on that, which allows us to change out the different specials and things. And it really does make a difference with what people stop. So when we put melons on there, which we'll have this afternoon, we'll have some watermelons starting this afternoon, we will put watermelons, and literally we'll start having more people come in asking for watermelons. So having that aspect of location is so key. Now, let's say you're in Utah. You live in a town of 500. you're going to have a very different business model than we are. We're producing a lot of salads, a lot of ready to eat, a lot of prepared things that people want to grab and go because they can. They can drive right in, grab it and go. But if you're in very rural Utah, Wyoming, even the central states, even in Vermont, there's some very rural areas, you're going to want to have to travel with your product. So you want something that's light, or you want to be able to cram a lot into your vehicle, only leave your farm 1 day a week and sell at a 4-hour farmer's market. So there's gonna be a different model you're going for depending on what your location is. So that's just an important point, is figure out what you want your farm to be and put that business model through where your location is of your farm. All right, I want to show you that last thing we talked about, which is political climate. And, you know, a lot of people are like, yeah, you know, wherever I land is probably going to be fine. But, you know, truth be told, we landed in a little community which is poorly run, to say the least. So this is our big greenhouse here. It's 36 by 200. We do propagation on this end. We're drying some herbs over here. We do growing down at that end. But we put it up this spring. And we brought in 2.5 million BTUs from the road to run all these greenhouses, because eventually there'll be 3 or 4 greenhouses lined up here. And this is the first one we're building. It's technically called Greenhouse 2 because of the location. But we had to run gas. And so we ran the meter to here. We ran to the industrial piping. You can see it throughout there, right to here. And then we said, okay, let's hook it up. Well, they said, well, you need a commercial permit. You need a sign off from your city on that. And I was like, no, we're agricultural. We didn't have to pull a permit to build the structure, but we're agricultural. And so I called onto the city and said, hey, we don't need a permit. I've read your code and it says we don't. They said you do. We argued for about a week. I gave up because I needed to get the gas installed. Well, I went out and got some quotes. You can see the gas line starts right there, terminates right there, okay? It's like 30 something feet of gas line. It's a couple $100 in parts. I had one guy come out. That would before I found out I had to have it commercially inspected, state licensed, whatever the sort of thing that I needed. And he was gonna do it for $500. Well, the first quote I had to put the commercial aspect in was $3,800 just to run that little bit of gas line, okay? The second quote was $1,000. We obviously went with him. Again, it took him another couple weeks to actually get it done. And the inspector walks out and the inspector says, he called us, got on his phone. I was like, uh-oh, what's going on? He says, I didn't need to do this. He's like, this was a complete power grab from the city. You did not need a permit from us, and I can't sign off on this because I don't actually have anything to sign off on, which meant that it threw it back into the energy people's, the gas companies' information and system, which it sat for another 3 weeks because they couldn't figure out how to do this without an actual inspection from the city. So needless to say, where your farm is located and the political climate in that town. So I know there's some towns which are incredibly farm friendly. In our town, the people love us. We love our community. There's a ton of great people. There's a constant stream of people in and out of our bus talking about how they love this. But the powers that be make it very difficult for businesses. And it's not just for us, it's for all businesses. It's been something and something I'm actually looking to change. But that is something you want to think about going into community. And so when we recommend people finding a new farm, we recommend moving into an area, rent for a year. Do not purchase for that first year. Rent, do another job, work for somebody else. Just get your feet underneath you, figure out the lay of the land, meet people. Because A, after that year, you'll probably get a much better deal. And B, you'll know the backstories of all the land and the people, and you know who to trust and who not to trust. And you'll have a much better idea of getting a profitable farm started for you and your family. So there you go. Those are the 4 things I wanted to share with you today. Number 1, soil. 2 is water. 3 is location. And 4 is the political climate of your area. Super important. We also have an ebook and we have a course on this as well. So if you want to go grab those, I'm sure there's a link below somewhere or above or to the side that you can go click on to grab that information. But there you go. Enjoy. Make sure you follow our page or click the subscribe button to make sure you get all the updates from our channels.
All right. Thanks, Carlos. Hope you all enjoyed that. And one of the main things that really just stuck out to me is, as I'm listening to Michael speak, is what Rusty said in terms of don't make enemies with your local zoning board. So I think Michael really gave a great example of some of the challenges he's faced within his community in Ohio. All
Andy,
right.
could you tell us the name of his farm again? I'm sorry.
His new
Or
farm,
his name.
Michael Kilpatrick is his name. And he is in, I believe, southwestern Ohio. It's been a year or so since I spoke with him, so I'm trying to remember here. But yeah, I worked closely with him more when he was in New York. But he was at a large scale tractor farm with he and his brother then. Again, they started it right in high school and managed it for 10 years. Very successful farm. All right, so I think that's a really great segue into what I want to cover now. And again, a lot of this is to really get you thinking about what we're going to see in Baltimore and some of the questions you can start thinking about for the farmers there. And all right, and I also just want to mention Margot is uploading a site assessment sheet into Teachable in tonight's folder that we created. You know, there's a lot more questions you can ask on it, but it gives you a basis of what to think about in terms of land access. I think all of us as technical service providers get lots of calls all the time saying, hey, we just bought this land or got this land and we can't wait to start farming on it. And as we start sort of asking these questions on the list, we find out there's sort of land and then there's farmland. And there's a big difference as to what you can actually grow well on and help you manage towards your goals. So a lot of folks are buying cheap land, but maybe it's up on a hill that doesn't have access to utilities or possibly doesn't even have a access road so you can get crops to your vehicle to get to market quickly. But there's a lot of things to consider, and zoning for urban agriculture is huge, and cities you know, are dealing with it in many different ways. And I think that's also the importance of having food policy councils and other folks to help support urban agriculture. Baltimore is a really great example of this. They have faced for years issues within water access for urban farms. And we'll probably hear a lot about that while we're there. All right, next slide, Carlos. So we're gonna start with land access and some of the things I've run into. So this is a farm, urban farm I helped start, I think in 2008 or 9 in Northeast Pennsylvania. It's was part of a college. And we were supposed to have land actually on the central square of the school, right next to a greenhouse. And right before we started planting, I mean, literally within minutes, someone from the school came out and basically kicked us off saying we couldn't disrupt their Frisbee field. So they pushed us down the road to this spot that the school owned. And before I sort of dive into some of these components, feel free to unmute yourselves or put in the chat, but if, anything that really sticks out to you in terms of this site. How does it look to you all? Like a great spot for an urban farm? Any challenges, concerns? Any comments?
Yeah, how about it's right next to it's in that parking lot area. So I guess my first thing would be people are going to walk through that because there's a sidewalk right there on the right-hand side. The parking lot's on the left. If I want to get anywhere on the right, I'm not walking around that building because I'm a lazy American. I'm going to walk straight across the front. So that would be my first, I guess. How do I keep people out of my stuff, out of the soil, and trespassing and putting messing up our crops?
So security and access are big concerns. I did end up putting a fence up, but a much different type of fence than what I'm normally accustomed to in a rural area where I'm really trying to fence out pests, primarily deer. Here, it's really trying to keep human foot traffic out as well as possibly a couple dogs and cats, but a much different type of fencing system would be required. But Wagon, you also started talking about the parking lot. Anyone have any thoughts on the parking lot there?
Runoff of oil, gas, particulate matter.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. So that was a big concern, being right up against a parking lot. So I did put up a berm, but I didn't feel as comfortable growing food as I would have been in a different spot. In fact, my recommendation was to put this into cut flowers for that reason. Not going to go into what the decision was made, but historically speaking, this was a restaurant, and they tore the restaurant down, removed the soil, and brought in 4 feet of river bottom soils. Any other thoughts?
There's several comments, Andy. I don't know if you're seeing those.
Uh,
Soil quality, the parking lot, sidewalk. Yes, soil quality concerns. Being close to the road and parking lot might get winter snow plowed onto your plot.
How about water? Where is it?
Okay, these are all great. So water was in a building on the other side of the parking lot, so we were able to run a hose. We did have to run it through across the parking lot, which was not ideal. Someone mentioned the street, I believe, which was another major concern, because right at the bottom right-hand corner where the 2 sidewalks meet is a 4-way stop. And I was concerned about exhaust from cars idling at the red light or the traffic light there. Another concern was the overhead street lighting. I wasn't sure if that would affect germination rates or the impact on vegetation and fruiting growth of the plants. I also looked at the sun throughout the day, which noticed the building right in front there caused quite a bit of shading right in the afternoon. So crop selection was important to consider in terms of sun access. Anyone else? Snow, definitely, in terms of plowing. All right, well then, just looking at the bullets here, I think I covered sort of the big ones, but things I do consider, you know, going back to some of those first questions we asked in week 1, you know, are the markets and the size of your land allowing you to manage towards your goals? And so the size of the property is really important. We look at the physical conditions and topography in terms of runoff, soil condition. As I mentioned, 4 feet of river bottom soil was brought in here. Sunshine, I mentioned. Site access, you know, how close are you to being able to bring your vehicle, to load up for tools or to get to market. Utility, talked about water, but, you know, understanding, you know, what utilities are there and how does that work. Relationship to your community is huge. When we first started growing here, the neighbors all across the street in the row houses looked at us and thought we were just crazy. But once they saw plants growing and saw the engagement of the students and kids in the neighborhood, completely changed their image. And next thing you know, they all wanted to volunteer. So it's just amazing to always see them outside asking questions and really wanting to be involved. Buffer zones, we talked about sort of more of the exhaust at the 4 corners there. Security mentioned in terms of fencing, but also, you know, are your tools safe? Do you need a shed with a lock on it? There are reports all throughout the country of urban farms being vandalized and people just coming in and stealing food. And, you know, on some aspects, maybe it's a community component where, you know, folks are okay with this if people, you know, need access to healthy and locally raised food. But if you are trying to make a living, that's really important to think about in terms of security. And also site control in terms of availability, whether you're buying the property, leasing it, which leads into the next slide, I believe, Carlos. Yeah, so within that same year, I also started a multi-backyard urban farm in my own neighborhood outside of my work with that farm and with NCAT. But that really meant that I wasn't going to buy every piece of land to meet the size that I needed. So I did come up with land agreements. And there's several sort of templates out there, but sort of some of the big components that really I needed to make sure were included, because this is a commercial business, because I was targeting profitability and you know, needed to manage my expenses. It was really important that these components were understood with the landowners. So one is having the terms of the agreement, start date, end date, things like that. Also working out whether you're renting the land, how much upkeep you have to provide. Barter is pretty common, but I would say it's also very tricky within working with your accountant and IRS components. So keep that in mind. Appearance, we really want to, you know, make sure this is someone else's land, so we want to not, you know, disrupt their property value, but we want it to look good. In sort of my view, a good looking farm is a good earning farm. So appearance is really important. Insurance, I think we talked about Every landowner should probably ask about it, but you're going to want to carry liability insurance, whether it's, as I mentioned, we have a covered plan that includes all liability, whether you're at market on your own farm. So there are certain levels of insurance you'll need. In my lease, I always wanted to explain what types of crops I was growing and also the practices I was using. I wasn't certified organic, but I practiced the rules and regulations to the organic program. So it's really important for me that they understood that and didn't walk outside and with a bottle of Roundup and maybe hit a few dandelions that they were worried about on their pathway to their garage. But I just really wanted them to understood that this was an organically grown farm, and they need to acknowledge that and understand not to be out there with any chemicals that may jeopardize the produce. Work schedule was really important. Just making sure I try to do a set time of when I'll be there, whether it's Tuesdays and Thursdays from this time. Obviously, there are certain times you have to get there that are unexpected, but the more leeway you can give a landowner, the more appreciative they'll be and want you to continue farming there. Water usage is a big one. Because you're probably going to be tied into a landowner's their account. So there are ways to offset what the farm uses, including a separate you can do a separate meter, but there are also ways to meter out what you're using specifically to the farm, which is inexpensive to do. Explaining what type of equipment and tools you'll have on the property, which is also really important to call dig safe before you do any type of digging on a property to make sure there's no buried utility lines. And one of my favorites is to explain that this is not a you-pick farm, that this is a commercial operation and that your livelihood depends on what's being grown there. So despite the landowner looking out their window, probably after a long day at work and seeing this beautiful salad bar, they may want to just go out there and graze a little bit. But they need to understand that they shouldn't be doing that. You're taking that to market, and certainly, they can buy it, but they shouldn't be out there helping themselves. And finally, close down. What happens at the end of the season? Are you coming back the following season? Should you put it into cover crop or sod? But just understanding as you leave and wind down the season, what that looks like. Next slide, Carlos. So I think, as Rusty mentioned too, the importance of understanding the history of your land and just really doing a lot of research, whether it's at your local courthouse, within your local municipality, even just going right on Google Earth and seeing what you can find. There are a few specific sites that I found really helpful. One is sometimes you can find Sanborn maps, which are the old, I guess they're fire maps for insurance companies. But they can really provide a lot of history of what's been on that parcel since they've been keeping track, which in a lot of cities is quite a long time. There's also the Right to Know network. So if you believe there was a business there, perhaps a laundromat or a gas station, Right to Know is an organization that collects spills and information around it. So if you're concerned about contamination, you can go to the Right to Know network and see if that address shows up in their database. Next slide. All right, so diving into sort of the soil component, which Michael really touched on first in his video. In urban soils, we're really worried about heavy metals as sort of the premier concern, primarily lead. There's also high levels of arsenic and cadmium found in a lot of urban areas. But just be aware that these heavy metals bind in the soil. They don't degrade. So in terms of remediation or mitigation, you've got to think about strategies for this in terms of your planting and what to do with these heavy metals. And just understanding that it all sort of stems from digesting the soil that has these particles, these heavy metals in them. So exposure at that level is really what's critical. And so a couple slides here on sort of remediation and mitigation components. Next slide. Starting with an understanding that in the US, we have threshold levels for heavy metals in soil. However, it's important to be aware that the EPA thresholds are not specific to growing food. What they are specific to is, it doesn't matter if you want to put in a playground, a soccer field, or a community garden, or your urban farm, the threshold levels are all sort of based on the same parts per million, according to the EPA. Other countries, this is much different, But just knowing that there are these threshold levels, and for lead, it is 400 parts per million. Next slide. So as I mentioned, sort of the strategy, if your soil tests positive for heavy metals or contaminants, is to figure out how you're going to deal with it. And sort of two strategies are the mitigation side and the remediation side. One is, again, understanding that these contaminants bind in the soil. They're always there. So whether you're going to keep that soil there and mitigate with that, or remediation is actually removing the soil and bringing in new soil, which I mentioned on the farm we had in Pennsylvania there, where there was a restaurant. But diving into this a little bit here, there's a lot of considerations. Next slide. Is as you're looking at what is available, what you can consider for dealing with contaminated soils. One is seeing, first and foremost, what options are available in your area. There's a lot of strategies out there, such as soil steaming, that just may not be available in your area. So first is understanding what actually can you consider in your urban area, but then really diving into the cost, because they're drastic. So putting in some raised beds versus bringing in an excavator to dig out 4 feet of soil and bring in new soil, there's a big difference in cost there. So, you know, what level of expense are you able to manage? And that can help guide some of your decisions here as well. There's also components within time frame of implementing some of these strategies, different effectiveness based on what you're utilizing, as well as environmental effects. And for me, the big one is understanding that, again, these contaminants bind in the soil. So if I'm removing that soil, it's going somewhere else. You know, it may not be in my backyard, but it's going somewhere else, and it's going to pollute that area wherever it goes. And first and foremost is making sure none of the soil ends up in your compost, because it's not going to break down in your compost that you're going to reapply on your soil. Next slide. So sort of the low hanging fruit here, or reducing the low level contamination levels, is making sure you're just washing your hands, washing your vegetables. If it's a root crop, you can peel the roots. If it has outer leaves, you can remove them. But again, these bind in the soil, you have to ingest them. So just walking through your soil, or if you have a dog going through and then they come in the house, they're tracking that into your house. So just understanding how you minimize those risks is really important, whether you leave your clothes in the garage, make sure your pets are clean. And there's also a lot of research done on taking iron, calcium, and vitamin C to help reduce the levels in human blood. Next slide. And I should say, within the lead, a lot of it comes from lead paint. Some of you may be old enough to remember leaded and unleaded gasoline, but most of what we see within urban soils comes from paint. So testing the paint, especially around windows, things like that, you know, flaking off, that's really where we see a lot of high levels of lead contamination. There's also things we can do within the soil. One is increasing the organic matter to help minimize the travel of the contaminants through the soil. Maintaining a soil pH of around 6.5 or 7 helps to stabilize the soil. But again, we can also sort of look at raised beds or other types of systems that allow us to not go directly into the soil, but allow us to raise above the soil. And here's a picture of some socks. They're called socks. This was at an Iowa urban farm I took. So it's a raised bed on mulch, helping to distance itself from the soil, but also growing in these socks. Next slide. So if you sort of dive into some of this, there's a lot of differences in research. And I found, to me, a lot of the information I felt most comfortable with came out of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture. And they've done a lot of research on looking at specific crops and how they take up contaminants, particularly lead. So some examples I found from their research shows that lettuce leaves can store 7 times more lead than carrots or root crops, and that within root crops, the leaves contain more lead than the roots themselves. So just this information of knowing if I'm on a contaminated site, it may affect my crop selection, to which, depending on the level of contamination, fruiting crops such as tomatoes or things that are above ground take up and store less heavy metals. And of course, depending on the levels, the number one recommendation is to not grow edible food, but maybe put it into ornamentals, cut flowers, as well as planting around the property to help reduce drift, as well as increase pollinator habitat. And looking at that picture, that's a colleague of ours farm in Kentucky. He did buckwheat along the side of the road as a hedgerow. Next slide. There's also opportunities within biological soil remediation, and this is a really fast and upcoming field. A lot of interest in mushrooms right now for this type of work. But what I will say is my understanding and my research shows that there's a lot of positive things coming out this at the research level, particularly within certain crops that can take up some heavy metals. But my understanding and research is that a lot of this is still at the research level, and so commercial seed is still not available for a lot of these varieties. So even though it's promising in terms of certain species taking, helping with bioremediation or phytoremediation, the seed source still is not at the commercial scale yet. But that just depends on some of these certain crops we're doing a lot of research on. Next slide. All right. Any questions regarding land access or contamination? We're going to talk a little bit more here about soils. If there are none, I want to sort of start to dive in the production aspects. And this slide says small scale intensive farming, which is my background, my passion. It could say urban intensive farming, but to me, these principles can happen wherever you are. But the idea is really focusing on 4 key components. 1 is soil health, 2 is close space plantings, 3 is successions, which Michael talked about in his video, and 4 is season extension. And I think Joe and Raphael from the USDA spoke a little bit about this in terms of the NRCS program for high tunnels, which you'll hear quite a bit about in Baltimore. But these components are nothing new. They've been around for centuries. They're talked about in the Bible and the floating gardens of Babylon. They go into Greco-Roman times where there's accounts of Emperor Tiberius falling ill and his doctors recommending that he needed certain vegetables throughout the year. So he was very instrumental in having his farmers figure out season extension so that he can have certain crops during the winter. Goes into accounts of season extension in Germanic times where it was considered witchcraft because they just couldn't wrap their heads around this idea that you're growing food in the off season or on the shoulders of the season through some of these techniques. But eventually, it really leads into what happened in France with this idea of growing on hot horse manure. And the picture in the bottom left, the 2 gentlemen there, that's in Paris. And at one point, Paris was sort of this hub of urban agriculture, and to the point where they're not only feeding all of Paris, but they started exporting to other countries, including England and Russia. And at that time, Russia and England were like, well, if the French can do it, we can do it too. And they actually failed. So Paris is like this great model of really understanding some of these components in terms of intensive production. But this picture to me just really speaks volumes because it's showing the intensity and amount of effort going into each plant. So these glass bells were creating a greenhouse over each individual plant. So they covered each plant with these glass bells, and then they rolled out a straw mat over just to get about 1 to 2 degrees extra protection overnight. But to think about the amount of labor that went into this, it does turn out that at the top of the bells, there's a notch. So they were able to throw a stick through several of them at one time and remove them during the daytime and then put them back at night. But still, that's, for each plant to be covered under one of those bells, it's pretty significant. And then the bottom right-hand picture is a picture of my friend's farm in Canada. He started a program called SPIN farming, which stands for small plot intensive. So he has sort of this whole design component that you can follow regarding the relays and spacing. So certain measurements he lays out if you're part of his program. I will say that there are several different systems out there for urban agriculture that all claim a certain monetary value, how much money you can make on a small scale. And I just want to caution you that, it doesn't work for everyone. And a lot of what I see in terms of these really high numbers happening on urban farms in a very small scale, I really haven't seen in this country. So it's a marketing component and it's a distribution sort of supply chain component. So a lot of these high numbers you may run into, in my experience, are mostly happening in Canada. Next slide. All right, so starting off with soil health here, there's sort of 4 key components. And if we were to talk about livestock, I would say there's more, but we are talking about urban agriculture, and specifically, the question of livestock in urban areas, it raises a lot of questions and concerns, but we're going to focus on the plant component. So here is just, understanding to minimize soil disturbance, to always make sure there's something in the root zone that's living to help feed the soil microbes, which really are the driving force. That's really what we're farming, and really, above ground or roots, root crops are really sort of the value added product. But, as farmers, what we're really farming is the biology in the soil. Diversification of crops is really important because just like all of us, we like to go to a buffet and pick and choose several different things. And that's exactly what the biology likes as well. If they just have one food source, it's going to create a certain type of system that in time is going to cause some problems. And so I think it's important too to understand that within each of these components, there's a lot we can do, but it could also be overwhelming, and it's probably not all going to happen at once. So just understanding, it may take time, but as long as we're managing towards that goal and managing towards soil health, that's okay. And I also just want to point out that on the ATRA website, we have a database of alternative soil testing laboratories. It's important to note that traditionally speaking, soil tests, which are primarily done by land-grant universities, originated from conventional agriculture and at a larger scale. Within the past 10 or so years, that's definitely changed, where they're a lot more focused on urban agriculture, smaller scale production, as well as organic production. But that's not to say that every lab does that or focuses on that. So if you do a soil test, and I encourage you all to do one, you may get results back that may have you scratching your head, as it may say apply so much ammonium nitrate per acre. And you're scratching your head saying, well, one, I don't even want to apply ammonium nitrate or don't even know where to get it. But 2, I'm not on an acreage scale, so I don't understand how these numbers line up in terms of what I need to apply for nitrogen. So again, a lot of labs have changed to focus more on a smaller scale, on an urban scale, but also there are alternative testing laboratories that you can go to this database and see what else is out there besides some of the land-grant universities that are private labs, but may focus more on some other components, including soil biology, which is a lot of new testing and components coming up to allow you to focus on that, in addition to the physical and chemical components of your soil. Next slide. So cover crops is a really big topic, and one we really don't have time to dive into now. But it's really critical in terms of keeping your soil covered, feeding the microbes, but recognizing that one is understanding cover crops and how they relate to your system requires you to figure out how you're going to manage for them. So there are tools at the tractor scale that are now down to the walk-behind tractor or manual scale, but understanding, how am I going to manage cover crops, while also recognizing that on a smaller or urban scale, it's really hard to utilize cover crops because most of our land's in production. So we don't have that ability to put land in fallow or cover crops and let it rest over time while other parts are in production, because pretty much at this scale, all of it's in production. And so I'll show you an example here soon, but of a picture of how we manage it going into winter on our farm. But cover crops are a really important component, but very tricky in an urban farm to figure out how to manage. Next slide. So the other thing we can think about too is close spacing, which if we pick up a seed packet, we can look at what their recommendations are for spacing between rows as well as between beds. And I want to point out that in most cases, those numbers are based on mechanical cultivation. So they figure that spacing is based on you on a tractor doing cultivation. If we're not on a tractor, we know we can intensify the system without really jeopardizing much of our yields or the quality of the product. Now, we may see reductions in yields per plant, but we're making it up and increasing it actually if we do it correctly on sort of a row bed system. And thinning and spacing could help for certain crops as well. We'll probably talk about this more in Baltimore. But again, just understanding what we pick up on a seed packet may not be exactly what we can actually do in the field on an intensive system. Next slide. And the other component is intercropping. As we have much of our land in production, we're trying to figure out how we can plant a cover crop or get to the next crop, knowing we have limited space. So the idea here is growing a fast and slow maturing crops together to increase productivity. So the bottom left-hand picture is a picture when we plant our carrots, which are slow to germinate, we identify in our crop plan our carrot beds. However, we mark the rows for us to cultivate with radishes. So once we plant carrots, we go directly over that same row and plant radishes, which are done within 30 days. So by the time they germinate, they start growing, then the carrots come up, and we know within 28, 30 days, we can start harvesting radishes without impacting our carrot bed. But again, that bed is identified and used for carrots. We're just able to get a whole nother crop off of it. The picture on the right is what I was sort of referring to in terms of cover crop and timing. This is a picture of our fall brassicas, some broccoli plants, knowing by the time we get this plant out, we won't have time before snowfall to get a cover crop established. So we can underseed or interseed the cover crop below our cash crop. And so there we have our broccoli plants, but the picture of the germination there is of rye and hairy vetch cover crop, which is our sort of premier cover crop that we use. And I can talk more about that if we have time. Next slide. And the big one is season extension and succession. So here's a picture of our high tunnel, but also utilizing floating row cover, which is in that picture from Paris. They were using straw mats, which over time has become this fabric. A lot of folks refer to it as Agribon, which is just a company, but these are floating row covers. Some are used for pest control, but also for frost protection. So we can get a few degrees warmth and keep the frost off plants just by utilizing this fabric with hoops. But in terms of successions, which Michael talked about, is really critical, is making sure we constantly have something to go to market with, that we're not just planting one crop, we harvest it and we're done. And we sort of can do this in a couple different ways. One is we can take the same crop and variety and stagger the plantings, or we can take the same crop but different varieties that have different days to maturity and plant them at once. So sort of two different strategies here, if that makes sense, in terms of how we can stagger these plantings. But the main thing is, once a crop comes out, we're putting another crop in right away. So we're constantly having these successions so that we have something at market. Next slide. So you'll see quite a few high tunnels while we're in Baltimore. Here's several different types of ones that are out there. There's a Quonset style and a Gothic. So the Quonset is much more rounded, like the upper picture there, versus the Gothic, the picture of my high tunnel there with the snow, which the Gothic is necessary to shed that snow load. And in fact, if you are in the Northeast and you are accessing the NRCS program for high tunnels, the requirement and the specs are that you have to have a Gothic style high tunnel, which is much different in the South. The Quonsets are much more popular. But looking at different sort of components here, the picture all the way to the right, you can see the sides are rolled up, which is a really, I would say, common design now, but extremely helpful to have roll up sides. In fact, there's even roll down sides now by some manufacturers in terms of their research showing that it causes a little bit less stress on the plants along the edge there than the roll up side. So sort of when you open these sides every morning and you close them at night, some of those plants could get a little bit of shock. And then the picture on the bottom is floating row cover inside of a high tunnel. So the high tunnel is providing protection, but then we're putting on floating row cover just to give us a little bit more protection. And so within these high tunnels, we can grow certain plants throughout the winter with no heat, primarily spinach and some greens. And there's some of the coldest mornings you can go out there and the spinach will look terrible, but by mid-morning it'll perk up and be sellable. So there are certain crops, if you plant them by a certain time, usually by the end of October, it puts on enough growth so that you can harvest throughout the winter. Now, keep in mind, it's harvesting throughout the winter. You're actually not growing through the winter. You've got to have enough growth before those temperatures get too cold. Next slide. So then there's this sort of big question of, how do we figure all this out? How do we know what to grow, how much to grow, where does it go in the field, and when do we plant it? And so this is sort of bringing in together crop planning, which we talked about in terms of a component of a business plan, sort of that production plan. You don't have to get into so much details in your business plan of this, but having this component is really critical, especially if you have labor on your farm, so that anyone could pick this up at any time and know, hey, the farm manager's not here today, you're not here, but I know by this plan, I know I have to plant this crop in this space today. And I just want to point out on the ATRA website, we have a webinar that sort of walks you through this whole process. So you can definitely check that out on our website. Next slide. And so when we look at a crop plan, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about one, a long-term crop plan that's really focused on soil health and sort of our long-term objectives. But really what we're talking about is an annual crop plan of what we're doing this year. And for us, it's just working backwards. So we want to understand where our markets are and what our harvest dates are, and also consider how much we can store, whether we have refrigeration, root cellar, whatever it is. But sort of taking that information and then just walking backwards all the way to when a crop needs to be started, all the way to how much I know what I have to order for the seed order in the winter. So, and again, doing it on paper, you're gonna have lots of revisions, but Carlos, if you hit your button there, I just wanna say it pays to plan. So if you instead are just going right out to the field, putting crops in the ground and not sort of going through a planning procedure, you could possibly run into some significant problems regarding space, regarding markets, regarding yields, all sorts of stuff. And again, this all ties back to cash flow. So I want to know how much money I'm going to be spending on my seed order and why. Next slide. So in one of your resources, in Teachable is a document called Scheduling Vegetable Plantings. And this comes out of it. So there's lots of spreadsheets out there, lots of software even, but this is just a general idea or model in that publication that you can look at to really help you map out, again, working backwards, all of your crop plans. So some of the categories here, you're starting with seeding, but then it's working to how, days to harvest and how often your successions are, interval between plantings, things like that. Next slide. So this is from when we used to go to farmers markets. This is sort of our succession plan, making sure we always had something to go to market. So every 10 days we were doing green beans, every 2 weeks we were doing beets. So sort of going down this list that, again, it was in this document, this crop plan that anyone could pick up and know, okay, I've got to plant kale today. But just running through this, knowing here's our successions or relays so that we had a consistent supply to go to market. Next slide. And sort of, again, to walk backwards, we can also take certain dates and just work backwards on the calendar. So this was a wedding we were supplying for. The wedding was on July 1st. So these were the 5 crops we were growing for the wedding. So we were able to just, again, work backwards, understanding it takes 50 days for bush beans to mature. These are direct seeded, so were the beets. So my seeding date would have been May 11th in order to have it available for July 1st delivery or end of June. But the other crops, the broccoli and the cut flowers, those all started in the greenhouse. So that's why we have that additional column there, knowing, again, the date we needed to start, how many days it's in the greenhouse before we transition out to the field. Next slide. And then in terms of harvest, there's sort of 2 components I want to point out. One is harvesting based on maturity. So we can look at our seed packet or look at a seed catalog and understand there's X amount of days to maturity for a crop. So we can really base it on that. But there's sort of these big questions we still have to ask ourselves, whether or not we're going to harvest today or if we can wait. And some of those are going to impact the size or weight of the crop or product, the price, the flavor, how well it stores, its nutritional value. But questions too of, if I leave it in the ground today, will it bolt or will it be more susceptible to pests and disease? Also really thinking about my future markets. If I take it out now, will I have enough for my next market? So sort of questions along those lines. And then next slide. But in terms of harvesting as well, we want to prioritize which crops come out at which time during the day. And this is really based on moisture or dew, as well as drying off and having direct sunlight, which would help reduce the amount of transfer of disease. So there are certain crops, particularly your greens, that you're going to want to harvest early in the morning while there's still moisture out, versus tomatoes or fruiting crops that you want to have all that moisture off the plants, and so you're going to want to prioritize to harvest those later in the day. Next slide. And I know there's a lot of interest in sprouts, shoots, and microgreens. And I just want to point out, so with sprouts, those are regulated by the FDA because they're not grown in some type of soil media. There is a higher risk of contamination and foodborne illness. So those are regulated. However, shoots and microgreens are traditionally grown in some type of growing media, whether it's soil or whether it's the picture there is of a coca fiber mat that I used to use called a baby blanket. So those are not regulated yet. But again, there's this big difference, just understanding there's this difference of what a shoot is, which is not grown, or a sprout, which is not grown in a soil media, versus a shoot or microgreen. So we can talk quite a bit about this. I'm not sure the farms will be seeing if they do microgreen production. The picture there of Farm Sweet Farm, that was a farm we toured at our last Arm to Urban farm, which was just amazing. They had this old warehouse that they put into microgreen production. And then they would deliver throughout the city on with a bike carrier. And then the other pictures are of my former shoot production, traditionally sunflower, sugar peas, corn, daikon radish, which are specifically bred for this, but would go directly to restaurants for not only salad mixes, but also for garnishes. Next slide. All right, so just a couple things as I sort of finish up here that I wanted to touch on based on some of the things Tammy mentioned last week in her marketing presentation. Next slide. And the first is just knowing what Tammy said in terms of knowing your story. It adds value to your farm, it adds value to your product, and people are going to want to know your story. Next slide there, Carlos. So you can go ahead and just read this, but this is from my friend who's just outside of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, right where Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia come together, the old Federal Armory. So she farms there. And I just think it's just a really great example of the elevator speech, of knowing your story, not getting too much into it, but just enough to give people the information that really, again, is putting that premium price on your product. All right, next slide. So this is sort of a recap of what Tammy talked about, but really the big questions that go into your marketing plan. Understanding, who is your customer? What's the size of the customer base? And this is really important. It could vary even within the same market. That could happen on a different day of the week. For example, we used to sell at a market in DC where on one day of the week, we would take kale as full bunches, which are used for steaming, which did really well one day of the week at that market. But a different day of the week, we had a really hard time selling that product, but came to understand that customer base wanted more of a smaller plant kale to go into salad mix. So here we're growing the same crop on the same bed, but changing when we harvest based on who our customer base was, even at the same market, just a different day of the week. So understanding these sort of components is really critical and could really help boost your sales. So understanding who the customer base is, their location, their influence. Tammy talked about selling direct versus wholesale, as well as intermediate markets, going to either a food hub or restaurant or institution. I think we talked quite a bit about the competition, and I think some folks said, when they get to market, they walk around and see, who they're competing against and what those prices look like. So understanding even seasonal price fluctuations, and in my experience, the sooner you're there, you're more able to set the price component. And that's where season extension comes in, because beginning of the season, end of the season, you can really tailor that premium price. It's sort of when the bigger farms come in, the wholesale farms that have a much larger quantity, they can set the price, which sort of at that point, in my experience, I'd back away a little bit from knowing I could not compete with the bigger farms, but that allowed me to focus on some novelty crops and sort of exotics that just weren't the traditional crops you'd see at market. So understanding two, quality standards, food safety standards, thinking about your time, your labor, and costs just to get to market. It's one of the main reason we still don't go to farmers markets. It was just too much time off farm, and for us to really be profitable would require us going into the Boston market, which is over an hour away. So we did more of the local market just as, to show support for our community and to be out there, but just wasn't profitable, and it was a lot of time off farm. So that's one market we decided to drop. And as I mentioned, food safety considerations as well. Next slide. So Tammy talked quite a bit about pricing as well, understanding what you're competing against, but I just want to drive home the point here of really understanding how you prepare your products. Is it bulk? Is it bagged? Is it bunched? Can really impact the price. And if you hit enter there, Carlos, there are certain tools out there that can, prior to going market, give you a weekly understanding of what sort of the going rate is at a terminal market or at the wholesale market. So it's not to really say, you should charge this, but it can give you a sense going into the market of what the weekly price is based on your location. So it uses these tools. For example, at the Rodale Institute is just one tool. They're all sort of based off these USDA market reports, weekly market reports that look at terminal markets in major cities. So you can look at, I don't know if Baltimore is listed, but Boston, San Francisco, sort of understanding within your region what the weekly price is, just to give you a sense of what people are going to be charging, while noting the importance that we talked about in weeks 1 and 2 of understanding your costs. So you can look at this, but also know like, wow, I have to charge so much more for my carrots just because I'm looking at my expenses. So again, it's really, this is just to help you understand the market, but really it comes down to understanding your costs of production. So next slide. So one thing that I learned from my friends at Spin Farming that really impacted us when we were urban farming is, in going to the farmer's market, was pre-bunching or pre-bagging products. And I think Michael mentioned a little bit in his video at the beginning of today about grab and go, which really impacted our sales. As much as I want to talk to my customers and I want them to know where their food comes from and about the farm and my story, some of these lunchtime markets, that grab and go component can be critical. So if it's pre-bagged, pre-bunch, they can just walk by, grab it and go. But that being said, setting up a tier system we found to be extremely valuable. So instead of charging price per pound and having to weigh things out, bog down the customer with their time, if we were able to set up a tier system, we were able to do a lot more sales. So on this grab and go type component. So things like 1 for 3 or 2 for 5. It's more of a marketing trick. So the customer thinks they're getting a deal, but ideally you're establishing the weight or bunch size based on what you need to make. But just again, that grab and go, 1 for 3, 2 for 5. I'm not bogged down weighing out on a scale. I'm easily able to make that transaction. Change is easy to work through, and just allowed for a lot more higher sales. Next slide. All right, and so finishing up, I just want to show this price grid as an example of how crazy it is to shop these days. I mean, you all know it, let alone all the labels that are out there. Just looking at one of these price grids, this is from 1125. So if I look at a case of green cabbage, 40-pound case on the wholesale market, conventional market, that's $14 a case. If it was locally produced, it was going for $20.50. If it was local and certified organic, it was going for $44. That's a big difference between $14 and $44 for the same case of cabbage. So some of these numbers are pretty interesting, like spinach. The organic actually went down, which I believe this is because when I took this, there was a spinach scare happening nationally, that there was one farm that was being shut down, an organic farm, for contamination. So the price dropped. But overall, if we see, the question, do we buy organic over local or not? It's hard to say, but just looking at what the going price rate is really can impact some of the decisions of whether or not you want to certify organic, which is tricky on an urban farm, as we had talked about. But just knowing, again, from the conventional market to local to organic, there's big fluctuations in price. Next slide. All right, so I'm just going to finish up here because one of the big topics and questions we received throughout the sessions is about funding opportunities. And there's a lot out there. That being said, a lot of them are based on having to do some type of research and or educational components. And these are more on the, I would say, federal and state side. So I listed here several opportunities in red that are from the federal side, the USDA. So we did hear from Raphael and Joe from the USDA Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production. They also are closely related to NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we'll talk more about that in Baltimore based on the high tunnel component and some other programs where you can cost share on, which are not technically grants. But there's other ones out there. SARE is a great opportunity. They have a farmer program. It does require some type of research, but if you have a question that you want to try and figure out on your farm, you can apply for SARE funding, and they may grant you some funding for it. There's value-added producer grants. There is continuing to be the cost share program for organic certification, which went away for a while, but now it's back at 50% cost share. So if you are interested in certifying, they will provide 50% of your yearly certification costs. There's farmer market promotion programs, which is really given to farmers markets, but if you're on the board or as vendors, you may want to talk to your market manager about. This can help with outreach, marketing components, signage, as well as access to SNAP or WIC programs to have EBT machines at your farm stand or at the farm, which definitely helps increase sales as well, while also providing access to healthy and local foods to those in need. And there's also, there's a whole slew of USDA programs also through NIFA. But again, here you've got to have some type of research and education component, and it usually requires you partnering with a university organization like ours to help lead the project. At the somewhat state level, there's something called specialty crop block grants, are specifically geared towards what is termed a specialty crop, which is vegetables, fruit, but not field crops, not grains, not livestock. This is federal funding, but it's administered by each state Department of Agriculture. So you'd refer to your state department for knowing when the grant application comes out, things like that. But really another great opportunity for funding. Of course, there's foundations and organizations. You're familiar with Farmer Veteran Coalition we talked about. There's other veteran organizations out there that provide funding and opportunities. So just a lot out there, and I'm sure Margot has a whole directory she can help you with, as well as private funding opportunities. Kubota is one of them. They actually have an agreement with Farmer Veteran Coalition. So for their members, they offer 0% financing for veterans, not only on tractors, but also all the implements, Land Pride implements that Kubota makes. I think it's Home Depot and Lowe's. I think one of them dropped, but just lots of local resources out there that also provide discounts and funding for veterans and or farmers. So just wanted to share that. And just in closing, I believe I have one more slide here just to finish up everything. So sort of bringing together what we've learned so far through the 4 sessions. And we want to start small, diversify, and as Michael said, work for someone else, or don't quit your job yet, but shop around, learn the system, make sure that the land is what you want before really diving in and taking on a lot more risk and possibly a lot more debt. So we talked about in the first session, you want to design now, but also think about the future, because a lot of those costs of infrastructure and building out your farm and the systems, ideally you could do all of that up front and sort of grow into them without having to go back and redesign or put more costs into some of the infrastructure. And most importantly, using your goals, your holistic goal, your farm goals, your family goals to really help drive your decision-making process, while also knowing that you need to monitor them regularly and that they are fluid. They should change. Your holistic goal shouldn't change, but at this scale and in this opportunity, you have the availability to make quick in-season adjustments, which larger scale farms just can't do. And finally, you want to sell quality, which not only is within the crops themselves, freshness, flavor, and variety, but also within your customer service. Again, folks really want to know who's producing their food. They want to know your story. That all adds value, and so does how you interact and what you offer. So thank you all so much. I know, again, it's a lot to take in such a short amount of time. But before we transition over to Catherine, I just will see if there's any questions. All right, well, this presentation will be uploaded to the folder as well as it's in the recording. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Catherine Favor, who is with NCAT's California office located in Davis. And Catherine has a lot of experience, particularly within agroforestry. And so she's going to talk about urban agroforestry. Thanks, Catherine, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Let me see, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay.
Yeah.
So today we are going to be talking about urban agroforestry. There you go. A little bit about me. Andy already introduced me, but I'm Catherine and I work at NCAT's Western office in Davis, California. And I do have a background in agroforestry. I got my master's degree in agroforestry from University of Missouri, and I got my bachelor's in viticulture. So trees and grapevines are my passion. Also, I'm permaculture design certified. And I used to work on an urban agroforestry system in San Diego. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from personal experience. And yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk about trees with you all and how we can incorporate them onto our farms. So one of my intentions for today is just to create awareness about urban agroforestry and its applications as a sustainable and appropriate cropping system for urban areas. We'll talk about agroforestry in general, because it's probably a new term for some of you. And then we'll do a deep dive into urban agroforestry. And I want to talk about how we can arrange trees to meet your goals for each individual farm, urban agroforestry's benefits that are specific to urban areas, some of the challenges of urban agroforestries and how to address them, and also how you can engage your communities and strengthen your regional food system. And through all this, I hope that this presentation also inspires you to think about the many ways that you can incorporate trees onto your farms, and hope we can provide some resources to you so you can do it. So let's dive in. Let's talk about what agroforestry is. If you don't know the term, it's an umbrella term that basically means the intentional integration of trees into agricultural systems with crops and or livestock. So there's two components to the word. Agro in agroforestry refers to agriculture, and that's the crop component. And then forestry, easy, that refers to the tree component. So it's basically integrating your crop component and your tree component into a single system. These graphics, you can kind of see, I'm sure you're aware of what monoculture systems are, just one crop over and over and over. Obviously not the most sustainable way to grow food. And you have polycultures, which are better. That is multiple crops grown in the same system. These systems are much more resilient. And when we talk about agroforestry systems, we're basically talking about woody polyculture systems. So it means there is more than one crop grown in one system, but that second crop is going to be a woody species, a tree or a shrub. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do this. Again, agroforestry is an umbrella term, and under it, there are a lot of different practices. So we're going to talk about all the different practices that are out there. But I do want to make a quick note about the term agroforestry. So it's a new term, but indigenous peoples have been practicing agroforestry since time immemorial. So I do just want to acknowledge that. Science is just recently catching up, but science finally, is looking at this and seeing that there really are huge benefits for both the environment and for our wallets and just for our communities as a whole. So we're going to talk a little bit about those benefits. Why are trees good for our farms and why it is important to utilize them? So as you're all aware, farmers today deal with so many issues ranging from environmental contamination and degradation to reduced productivity for a number of reasons, pesticide reliance on pesticides. There are just a bunch of different issues that farmers deal with. Of course, climate change. It's always been hard to be a farmer, but it's even harder, it feels, in today's day and age. And trees really provide resilience to a farming system in a lot of ways. So I've sort of broken up the benefits of agroforestry into four main categories that we'll dive into. The first one is environmental. Trees do a lot of things to benefit the planet as a whole and our entire global ecosystem. Trees have a lot of economic benefits as well. Incorporating trees onto your farm is good for your wallet and your bottom line. There are on-farm benefits. Trees do a lot of things that are good for your farm sustainability and productivity. And then of course, there are lots of social benefits. Trees provide a lot of benefits for your own personal well-being and for the well-being of your community. So before we dive more into that, I do want to discuss the 6 main ways of arranging trees on farms. There are so many different ways that you could incorporate trees onto your farm, but the USDA has kind of broken up those ways into 6 broad categories with names. So in temperate environments, there are 6 main practices or ways that you can arrange trees and incorporate them into your system. And these practices are windbreaks, alley cropping, silvopasture, riparian forest buffers, forest farming, and then urban agroforestry. And urban agroforestry was actually just acknowledged, and it's my favorite. So we're going to get into all of these just briefly, and please stop me if you have any questions, because this is a lot of information and a lot of new vocab. So please let me know if you have any questions. So the first practice that we're going to talk about are windbreaks. Windbreaks are linear plantings of trees along the perimeter of a farm. They're usually 1 to 3 rows deep, and they function to do a lot of things. They protect crops from wind, and that also means protecting soil from wind. A lot of erosion is caused by wind, and so when you have a windbreak on your farm, you slow down wind, you prevent soil from being lifted off and out of your farm, which is great. You keep nutrients in your soil that way. Windbreaks also protect from pesticide drift, which is really, really important. Pesticides and other chemicals that are sprayed elsewhere often arrive on our farms through the wind, and windbreaks significantly slow down wind so that those pesticides don't actually get to your farm. So that's hugely important. They also provide privacy as well, just a barrier between neighbors. They can also reduce odor as well. Windbreaks are pretty common in areas where there are feedlots in rural settings, but in urban settings too. There are all sorts of smells that we deal with in urban environments, and trees actually really do act as a buffer to odors and to noise. Windbreaks also provide wildlife habitat, which is, again, very important in urban environments where there isn't usually a lot of habitat for wildlife, like birds. And lastly, windbreaks diversify your income. As Andy was talking about, it's so important to have multiple crops in one system so that you can have multiple revenue streams and have a backup if one market isn't doing so well. So here are some pictures of windbreaks. On the left, you can see this is a double layer of, you've got your trees and then you've got your shorter shrubs. So this is functioning to kind of break up wind that comes in at high levels and at low levels. And then on the right, we've got a picture of a windbreak. This was actually a windbreak. You can't really tell, but behind the windbreak is actually a composting facility. So this windbreak was really important. It served as a buffer between the composting facility and the farm. It reduced odors. It prevented a lot of the runoff from the composting facility from reaching the farm. So yeah, very, very beneficial. The next practice that we're going to talk about is alley cropping. And alley cropping is defined as rows of trees with a crop grown in between. So this picture here is a wheat and chestnut system in Missouri. And you could do this in an urban setting as well. You can have any crop in between rows of trees. And alley cropping is really great for a variety of reasons. It actually increases your whole farm productivity. Andy was kind of talking about this as well with intercropping. If you have an agroforestry system, if you have 2 species in one system, each individual species might produce a little bit less, but the farm as a whole is going to have greater productivity. So this is really good for your farm's bottom line. And this is basically because, well, in agroforestry's case, you're maximizing your vertical space. So you have your crop layer below and your tree layer above. So you're really maximizing the entire space that you have on your farm. And in urban areas in particular, this is obviously very important. We often are dealing with small spaces, land is more expensive. So it's really important to maximize our vertical space when we're in urban settings. And then just like with any agroforestry system, trees help reduce erosion. This is for a number of reasons. Talking about the above ground components that reduce erosion, basically trees, you know, they have leaves and those leaves fall and they create litter on the ground, they create mulch. And so water, when it's running across your farm, it's going to hit those leaves and it's going to get slowed down and it's going to sink down into your soil. And then tree roots below ground as well, they create better infiltration in your soil. So they make the soil more fluffy and allow water to actually sink into your soil rather than just running off of it. So trees are really great for that. Again, in alley cropping systems, trees provide wildlife habitat. And with that, they also attract beneficial insects. They provide habitat for all sorts of parasitic insects that parasitize or eat your the predator, your pests. And so that's really good. It can help you use less pesticides. One thing that's absolutely amazing about alley cropping is that it can help with microclimatic regulation. So trees kind of act as a buffer against both extreme heat and extreme cold. Obviously, we know that shade from trees helps reduce heat, so that's really good. And as long as you space your trees out well enough, the shade won't impact your crop below, but it'll provide just enough shade to reduce heat in the summer. And then conversely, in the winter, trees actually can radiate heat out at night, preventing frost damage. So trees kind of absorb heat during the day and then radiate that out to crops at night. And that can significantly reduce frost damage. So a lot of really great benefits that alley cropping has. And again, it can provide shelter from wind and improve soil health as well. These are some more examples of alley cropping. The picture on the right is an elderberry system. You can see on the borders, you've got elderberries, and then this is a cover crop that went in, but the field is getting prepared to have pumpkins on it. So this is going to be a pumpkin and elderberry alley cropping system. And then on the right, we've got a grapevine and olive alley cropping system, and that's actually in Mendoza, Argentina. The next system that we'll be talking about is silvopasture, and that is the combination of trees with forage and livestock. So trees added to an animal sort of system, a livestock system, they provide a lot of benefits for the animals. Basically, they just protect the animals from the elements. They protect them from sun, they protect them from rain, wind, snow, just all the elements. And that means that you're going to have less stressed animals. So it's actually been shown that dairy cattle produce more milk when they're raised under the shade of trees. And there's reduced calf mortality when you have trees in your system. Cattle increase weight at a faster rate. And in urban environments, we're probably not dealing with cattle, but you can also do this with chickens as well. So this was a silvopasture system that I worked on in San Diego, and the chickens were rotated between elderberry trees. And the trees are pretty young here, but they'll eventually get bigger and provide some of the shade and protection and even some nutrition for the chickens. More examples. Okay. The next practice that we're going to talk about is riparian buffers. So these are bands of trees in addition to shrubs, forbs, and grasses, and they're primarily along stream banks and waterways with the goal of protecting those waterways. So these trees function to protect streams from erosion. They also reduce runoff into the streams, and they actually prevent agrochemicals from reaching streams. So tree roots have the amazing capacity to filter out toxins from groundwater before it reaches a watershed. It acts like a sponge. And that's really amazing because, as you know, streams are very vulnerable to chemicals, and the wildlife that lives in streams can really suffer from agrochemical runoff. So riparian buffers significantly reduce contamination of our watersheds. Trees along rivers also keep water at temperatures that are amenable to fish and other wildlife, helping to protect their habitat even more. This is a kind of a horizontal crosscut of a riparian buffer. There are typically 3 zones. Zone 1 is unmanaged forest. Zone 2 has kind of more harvestable crops. You can put nut trees and fruit trees. And then zone 3 has a lot of grasses and smaller woody shrubs, woody florals, and forbs. Okay, the next practice is forest farming, and this is also known as multi-story cropping. And basically with this practice, you take an existing forest or orchard and you grow a specialty crop underneath that likes shade, such as mushrooms or herbs or coffee in some cases, even blueberries. These systems really serve to maximize your vertical space because you're getting a yield not only out of the trees above, but also out of what's growing below. That also, again, means diversified income, which means more stability. And if your overstory is a forest, this means that you're able to preserve natural lands while you generate an income. These are just more examples of what this can look like. On the left, we've got yerba mate, which is grown under an avocado orchard. And on the right, we've got yerba mate, which is grown in the shade of a natural forest. So all of the practices that we just went over, and there were a lot, so please let me know if you have questions, and we'll have questions at the end too. But all of those practices that I just talked about can be applied to urban settings. So now we're going to talk about specifically urban agroforestry and how you can incorporate trees into urban settings. Urban agroforestry, the definition is just the intentional use of perennial trees and shrubs to improve the sustainability and resilience of urban communities. So there's an emphasis on the community aspect of urban agroforestry for sure. And now let's talk about what that looks like. All the practices that I just went over can be applied to urban areas, but it's going to look a little bit different, and there are going to be specific benefits that are very specific to urban settings. So depending on what issues you're dealing with, you can decide how you want to arrange trees on your farm. One of the most common ways is just hedgerows or windbreaks, like we kind of went over. And again, that's just using trees on the perimeter of your farm. And in urban areas in particular, windbreaks serve as buffers for a lot of things. Along roads, it's really important to have a buffer. Trees block airborne pollutants that can come from cars, from traffic. They also prevent stormwater or floods from reaching your farm sometimes. You know, it's not foolproof for sure, but trees definitely act as a barrier to reduce some of that city runoff. They also block wind, and they act as a privacy buffer, which can be really important in urban areas. And they do significantly reduce noise, which is also very important. And because trees help slow down wind, they also slow down wind that might be carrying foul odors. So that's important as well in urban settings. So this is a picture of an actual windbreak at Coastal Roots Farm where I worked. So it's hard to tell, but in the background, that is a production greenhouse. And right next to it, you can't see this at all, but there was also a skate park right there. So this windbreak, just this row of trees, served as a barrier for a variety of purposes. It gave us privacy from our skate park and greenhouse neighbors, and it prevented noise from the skate park from reaching us. It actually really worked. And it also prevented pesticide drift from the greenhouse from reaching our farm as well. And we were certified organic, so that was really, really important for us that we didn't have any pesticide drift reach our farm. And the windbreak also provided a lot of wildlife habitat. This farm was in the middle of San Diego, right in the middle of a city, but just from having this little bit of trees, we actually were able to provide habitat to an endangered species. This is the California gnatcatcher, and we found its nest right there in those trees that you see right there. So that is pretty amazing that just a few trees, with just a few trees, we were able to provide habitat to an endangered species in the middle of a city. Another common arrangement for trees in urban agriculture settings is to arrange trees on contour to create what we call infiltration swales. So this arrangement of trees is similar to an alley cropping system that we went over, which is where rows of trees are interspersed with rows of crops. But in this case, trees are planted on berms, which are these mounds that you can see. So when trees are planted on these mounds, the tree roots stabilize these mounds as they grow, which turns them really into solid walls almost. And it's a little bit hard to tell from this picture, but this farm was on a hill. So we dealt with a lot of erosion and runoff when it would rain or when we would irrigate. And before we planted these trees here, our water and soil would just run off right into the street below. There was a road right on the other side of this farm. And the city wasn't happy about that. And we weren't happy about that because we were losing our water and we were losing our nutrients in our soil. So when we planted these trees on these mounds, that solved our problem. These trees really just served as a barrier, slowing down water and allowing it to sink into our soil. So what would happen was water would run down the hill and then hit that berm or that mound. And then it would sit in that little moat or swale that you can see right there. And the water would just sink right into the tree roots, essentially irrigating our trees, allowing us to use less water, which was very good because this is out in California and we didn't have much water. And then it prevented our water from running off the farm and into the street. So together, the tree roots and the hills, the berms, really did function to slow down the flow of water. Another very common way to arrange trees in urban agroforestry settings is food forests. Food forests are also called multifunctional woody polycultures. Some people refer to them as edible forest gardens or just edible landscaping. So as we mentioned before, polyculture just means multiple species of plants in the same system. And in this system, you've got a lot of different species in one system, and some of them are woody. So these agroforestry systems are designed in a way that mimic forest ecosystems. So picture a forest, just a wild forest where you've got an overstory, you've got your tall trees, and you've got an understory of smaller trees, and you've probably got some shrubs underneath and some vines maybe climbing up your trees. Then you've probably got ground cover, some forbs, some herbs, maybe some mushrooms. So picture that forest, but now picture that all of it is edible. That is basically what we're talking about when we refer to the term urban agroforestry food forests. And technically, in these kinds of systems, there are 7 layers. You've got your tall trees. These could be nut-producing trees like pecans or black walnuts or persimmons. They could be nitrogen-fixing trees as well. Then under that, you've got your short tree layer, the apples or pears, lemons, elderberries, anything really. And then below that, you've got your shrub layer, which could be berries, could be blueberries, currants, aronia, blackberries. And then you've got your vines, could be grapes, tomatoes, passion fruit, beans. And then below that, you've got your forbs or annuals or smaller shrub layers. That could be rosemary, lavender, sage, or even crops. So in our food forest, we grow asparagus and also some cabbage. Then you've got your ground cover. So this layer is kind of more sprawling. It can be sprawling herbs like mint or oregano, and they actually function to suppress weeds. And then finally, our last layer is our rhizosphere layer, which refers to our root crops, being carrots, beets, ginger, turmeric, ginseng. So 7 layers all in all. It's pretty wild. It's kind of unruly, but you know, everything's edible. And this way of organizing trees really maximizes your space and packs a lot into a small urban space. And also, it also produces a wide variety of food, which can be really important for strengthening local food systems. So some more examples. This was a picture of the food forest that I worked on in San Diego. This was recently planted. This system was 3 years old here, so the trees were kind of small, but you can see, I mean, they were pretty tall for being 3 years old, but this system will eventually evolve into being really like a forest, except for where everything is edible. And just a little bit more about the benefits of this system. Again, this system maximizes your space, and in urban settings, we're often very limited on space. Also, these are very productive systems because plants fill different niches, both above ground and below ground. With trees, as much as you see above ground is also below ground, meaning if you see branches that are 6 feet tall, generally that means that there are 6 feet of roots below as well. So above ground, if you're maximizing your vertical space, then that also means that below ground, you're also maximizing your below ground soil space. So you've got 7 layers above ground and then 7 layers of roots in the soil, meaning that plants' roots are filling up all the different spaces in the soil, really maximizing nutrient uptake. So it's a very productive system. These are just a few more pictures of that same system that I worked on in San Diego. As you can see, the tall tree layer in this case was elderberry. And then we had pomegranates below and also pineapple guavas. Then we also had our shrub layer. In this case, it was rosemary and sage. And our sprawling ground cover was oregano. It's kind of hard to see, but it sprawled, it covered the ground, and it suppressed a lot of weeds. And also, since this food forest was new and the soil needed a lot of fertilization, we also added in some nitrogen fixing trees, which took nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil, which made the soil a lot more nutritious without us having to add too much fertilizer. In fact, we just use nitrogen fixing trees and compost and nothing else. So these are just all of this, that food forests and windbreaks and planting trees on contour to create infiltration swales. These are just some of the ways that you can incorporate trees onto your urban farms. But there really are so many different ways that you can incorporate trees. So it's really just a matter of figuring out what problems you want to solve and what trees can do to solve those problems. So now that you've seen a little bit more about what urban agroforestry can look like, let's talk about the benefits of these kinds of systems that are specific to urban areas. And we've already talked a little bit about this. But again, there are all sorts of environmental, economic, on-farm, and social benefits to urban agroforestry. So we are going to break this down by topic. First, let's just talk about the environmental benefits. So we've already talked a little bit about how trees sequester carbon to fight climate change. They can also help localize water cycles. That's a bigger conversation, but they can help localize water cycles. And if there was enough agroforestry going on, they could probably help regulate some of our rain cycles. This would be hypothetical. This would be like if everyone was doing this. So, but something is something. And agroforestry systems also provide wildlife habitat, and that's very important in cities. As we saw with Coastal Roots Farms case, incorporating just a few trees on your farm can host wildlife, even endangered species, in the middle of the city. And we've also talked about how tree roots can slow down water runoff so that less goes into the gutter and so that more stays into the soil. And we've also talked a little bit about how trees help cycle nutrients in the soil, helping make soil healthy and nutritious. And as Andy mentioned, bio and phytoremediation are also really important topics to discuss in urban settings because urban environments have a lot of toxins. So we're going to kind of talk about that more. But yeah, as Andy was mentioning, for a number of reasons, urban environments just have a lot of toxins. They can be heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pathogens, even pharmaceuticals, from all sorts of things, sewage systems, road salts, plastic, landscaping. There are just a number of toxins that are in our urban settings, unfortunately. And trees actually can really help address some of these toxicity issues in your soil. So as Andy was mentioning, there is a lot of research that's just now being done about toxicity and how you can remedy that in urban settings. But some of the research that has come out shows that plants accumulate toxins in different parts of in different parts of the plant when they are doing phytoremediation. So plants can help break down a lot of chemicals, and they also can absorb heavy metals. And when those contaminants and heavy metals get absorbed, primarily they get absorbed into the plant's root system. And then after that, they get accumulated in the plant's woody biomass. So that's the trunk, and that is the branches and all of that woody biomass. And then after that, just a little bit gets accumulated in leaves. And then finally, very low amounts of heavy metals get accumulated in fruits. So because trees, as opposed to annual crops, have that woody biomass, they actually accumulate more heavy metals in their woody biomass than do annuals. And that's actually a good thing, because that means that more of these heavy metals and toxins get accumulated in the woody part, the part that we don't eat, and less is accumulated in the fruit, in the part that we do eat. So research has shown that annual crops actually accumulate more toxins and heavy metals in their fruit than do trees that produce fruit. So it's actually safer to eat, let's say, an apple from a tree in an urban environment than it would be to eat a strawberry. So that is really important in urban settings. If you really do have a soil that has high levels of contaminants, it might make sense to plant more trees and perennials on that land than annuals. There is some research that also shows that because trees do accumulate so many toxins in their woody biomass, that they can be used kind of like a cover crop to prepare your land for planting annuals later on. So I've heard of folks who've planted their urban agroforestry farms with elderberries for 2 years. And those elderberries grow really, really fast. They've got a lot of woody biomass. They grow and they accumulate toxins and heavy metals in that biomass. And then you can go through and chop those elderberries down, remove them from your property, dispose of them somewhere else. And then your soil will have likely a little bit fewer heavy metals. And again, though, it is really important to test if you have that capacity. And yeah, it is healthier and safer to eat fruit from a tree than from an annual fruit producing crop. So good to keep in mind. Yeah, those are the environmental benefits. And now let's talk about the economic benefits. So like we mentioned, agroforestry maximizes your space for increased productivity. So you're utilizing more vertical space, and in urban areas where land is expensive, that's very, very important. And then for cities' wallets as well, trees help manage stormwater, which helps save them money. So trees help reduce runoff and erosion, and that is very important for cities too. Now let's talk about the on-farm benefits specific to urban agroforestry. So we've talked a little bit about how trees can improve your pest control by attracting beneficial insects to your farm. So trees provide habitat for wildlife and also for beneficial insects that kill or parasitize pests. So you'll likely have fewer pests on your farm if you have trees on your farm. And like we mentioned, trees also regulate the microclimate, preventing heat damage and frost damage. And then in urban environments, soil can be very compacted as well. You might be growing food in a place that hasn't had vegetation on it for years. So your soil might be very, very compacted, and trees can really help to break up that compacted soil. If you utilize trees that are, we refer to them as pioneer trees. These are trees that thrive in areas that are kind of desolate. Those trees can dig down deep into the soil, break up those compacted layers, and prepare them for crops to come. So that's really important. We call those pioneer trees. And a lot of those trees actually fix nitrogen too. So they can both break up compacted soil and fertilize it and pave the way for crops to come. And lastly, we can talk about the social benefits of urban agroforestry. And there really are so many. First of all, there's beautification. You know, I think that this is really an undervalued benefit, but humans evolved to be in nature, and there are scientific studies that show that trees and flowers and shade actually make us calmer and make us feel more connected and can fight depression. So I think that having that nature connection is really, really important. And in cities, it's sometimes hard to find that. So I think the aesthetic aspect to trees and that nature connection is really important. And urban agroforestry also creates healthier environments for us. We talked a little bit about how the above ground biomass of trees can help slow down wind, and tree leaves can actually help filter out odors and toxins from the air. So it can prevent pollutants and pesticides from getting to us, which has a health benefit to our bodies. And then tree roots do the same thing. Tree roots perform phytoremediation, which makes the soil healthier and less contaminated. And these things have an impact on our health and our well-being. Urban agroforestry also reduces heat stress in the city. As we know, cities can get so hot in the summer from concrete and asphalt and everything. And trees really help regulate the microclimate by adding shade and humidity to our landscapes. Trees also reduce odors, which is very good for our well-being, and they act as a buffer to noise pollution, also very good for our sanity. And then, of course, trees contribute to local food security because you can produce a wide variety of crops with urban agroforestry. You can provide a variety of food products to your local community. So food will travel less, it's going to be fresher and more nutritious for your community, and it's better all around. And there is actually a lot of opportunity for community engagement with any type of urban agricultural setting, but especially with urban agroforestry. You can really use urban agroforestry as a backdrop to bring your community together and to educate people about where their food comes from. So in the food forest that I worked on in San Diego, we did a lot of community engagement. These are some pictures. We had a lot of really fun things that we did, both to help us manage our systems and also to engage our community. One of the things to keep in mind about having a diversified system like you do with that urban agroforestry is that inherently it's just going to be harder to manage. Managing multiple crops is just harder than managing one crop. That's a trade-off. It's a little bit harder to make things mechanized, and you might find yourself doing more things by hand. There are ways to set up your urban agroforestry systems in a way where you can mechanize a lot of things, but you might have to do some harvesting by hand or some maintenance by hand, which is why engaging the community is really important. You can make this a win-win. Honestly, the win for you is that people either pay to be there or they do some labor for free, helping you manage the system. And the win for them is an afternoon in nature, learning about where their food comes from, really connecting to the land and just having fun. So at the farm that I worked on, we had U-Picks, and we also had volunteer harvest days where we would open the farm to the community and they would come to volunteer and harvest. And then they would take a few things home. So that was the win for them. It was a win for them and it was a win for us. And honestly, it was so much fun to engage the community this way, and really relationships were formed this way. To this day, some of my closest friends I made during volunteer hours at this farm. We also engaged a lot with local schools who wanted to do field trips. And then we had fancier events as well that were really fun, like a foraging day where people would actually pay to come forage in the food forest, and they would, just forage for ingredients that they liked. And then we had a cook-off and we had a taste test to see who could make the tastiest dish from foraged foods. And, people paid to do that. So that was a big revenue stream for us. And we also had a food forest festival, same thing, people paid to come plant a tree. And we had music and dancing, and it was just a lot of fun. So win-win for everybody. But bottom line, you can diversify your revenue streams by engaging the community, and the community can help you manage your labor in an affordable way. So talking about community engagement in urban agroforestry systems, I do want to touch just on public food forests, which are engaging communities on a whole other level. There are a lot of public urban agroforestry food forests in the US. There are more than 60 to date. And this map right here is a map of all of them. So you can go visit them if you want. And public food forests are great because they provide a food source to literally anyone who passes by, helping build food security. And it's a great way for cities to just landscape in a pretty and sustainable way. So some examples are the Boston Food Forest Coalition, which has a bunch of different food forests all over the city. And Seattle's Beacon Food Forest is a pretty famous one. It's pretty big, and it's got, it's a park basically, but it's open to the public and people can harvest and eat and take care of it. And yeah, really, really neat place. Coastal Roots Farm in San Diego was where I worked. That was also public, open during certain hours. So it was kind of private, public. And actually, fun fact, but Disneyland's Tomorrowland was actually designed to be an urban agroforestry food forest. So it was originally landscaped with 100% edible plants because in the 50s, Walt Disney thought that in the future we might have food shortages with a bigger population and that we'd need to landscape our landscapes with edible food for our communities. So this is a picture of Tomorrowland. It's hard to see, but you can kind of see there's an orange tree in the background and an olive tree. There's some rosemary, and then up close, you can't see this at all, but there's cabbage and onions growing. So next time, if you go to Disneyland, look out for Tomorrowland. Everything is edible. So that is another example of an urban agroforestry food forest. But going back to private urban agroforestry food forests, there are a lot of drawbacks to keep in mind. Well, not drawbacks necessarily, but just challenges to keep in mind when you're going into this. Like I mentioned, agroforestry by definition involves more than one species. And so that means that there will be management complexity and competition. And that competition does have to be managed. The key is to maximize your synergistic interactions between species and to minimize the competitive interactions. So we already talked about all the synergistic interactions, all the ways that trees can benefit your farm. You know, we already mentioned they attract beneficial insects, they reduce runoff, increase water infiltration, increase soil health. They do so many beneficial things. Those are those synergistic interactions, but there will be some competition. And it's just a manner of managing that. So usually trees and crops compete for three things, and that is water, nutrients, and light. And there are several ways that you can manage competition in these areas. You can manage competition for water by having a complex irrigation system that delivers specific amounts of water to each species. So this here is a picture of our irrigation system, very complicated, but once we got it laid on the ground, you know, it was done, it was installed, and then we didn't have to think about it. But basically all the different numbers represent a different system. And each number here received a different amount of water. So everything was automated. And then also plants had different, everything was on drip. And plants had different amounts of drip emitters in rings around them. So we were able to regulate how much water each plant was receiving that way. This is in California where we get no rain. So it was really easy to just dial in the amount of water that we wanted each plant to receive. But if it's raining and you've got plenty of water, that's great. You won't have to worry about this as much. And then in terms of managing nutrients, plants do compete for nutrients as well. And you might have to manage this by fertilizing certain species more than others, or by incorporating nitrogen fixing trees into the mix. We found that this was really important and easy. Nitrogen fixing trees, they grow really well, they grow really fast in just about any type of soil, any type of environment. And then they provide that benefit of just fertilizing the plants around them. And in terms of managing competition for light, a way to do this is just by pruning your overstory trees or thinning them out. And then you can, when you do that, you can put that biomass on the ground, and that'll serve as mulch, which will suppress weeds. So there are a lot of different ways to manage competition. It's a little bit more complicated and more complex, but definitely worth it if your system is producing more actually. One other drawback to keep in mind is that it is harder to be certified organic when you have this diversified of a system. If you're certified organic, you have to keep an organic systems plan. And when you do that, you have to list all of the crops that you plant. And keeping track of how many of each species you planted in the diversified system can be a big undertaking. It's doable, we did it. Just requires a lot of time on the front end, but then after that, you don't have to think about it. But it is something to keep in mind. No matter what though, the most important thing to do is just to plan well. Before you plant, it's really important to make sure that you're selecting the right tree crop combination. So in permaculture, we call this guild selection. And this basically means choosing crops and trees that naturally grow well together and that are suited to one another. And there are lots of resources for figuring out what trees and crops go together. And it's just a matter of figuring out what each species needs and making sure that the other species doesn't take away anything that other species needs. So there are a lot of resources on that, and I can send you some if anyone has questions about that specifically for your growing area or for your goals. Another drawback that we touched on is that it can be really hard to manage and harvest when you've got such a diversified system. And so one way to do this is to arrange plants in linear patterns. This can allow you to mechanize your system a little bit more. You can still have a wide range of products, and as long as it's in rows that kind of allow you to have farm equipment that you can pass through with, then it's not that different from a monoculture system. Or if you do just have a wild type of system that looks like those food forests that we were talking about, again, you can engage your community. In permaculture, we have a phrase, the problem is the solution. And in this case, you know, our problem is that we need many hands to help us manage a diversified system. And the solution is to engage those many hands and to get them out there on the farm and help them learn where their food comes from and laugh together and have a good time. So here are some agroforestry resources for everybody. There are a lot. The USDA National Agroforestry Center has a lot of resources. The Center for Agroforestry at University of Missouri also has a lot of resources, a lot of great YouTube videos. Same with Savannah Institute. And there actually is the Northeast Mid-Atlantic Agroforestry Working Group that you can join. They're working on agroforestry initiatives specific to the Northeast, so they'll have lots of great recommendations for tree crops that are appropriate to the Northeast. If you do want to get involved with silvopasture, incorporating animals into your farming system, the Northeast Silvopasturing Group is really great. And if you want to do forest farming, the Northeast Forest Mushroom Growers Network can help with that. This website, forestassist.org, has a lot of tutorials, little free mini courses that you can take on agroforestry. And then the USDA plants database is really great just for figuring out what trees are appropriate for your environment. And then at NCAT, we have a few publications on agroforestry, and we have a lot of agroforestry specialists. So you can call us up. We have our hotline, of course. You can email me. I'm catherinef@ncat.org. And yeah, so there are a lot of different resources. So just reach out. And yeah, I think at this time we can just open it up to questions, because I know we covered a lot and a lot of new vocab there and a lot of new concepts. So if anyone has questions, I guess we can open it up for questions now.
I have a question about the ability of growing nuts along with fruit. Is that a, feasible idea?
Definitely. Yeah, you can totally grow nuts with fruit. It's just a matter of spacing. Each crop is going to have a different spacing requirement. But we grew nuts successfully with fruit. A good rule of thumb is to figure out your ideal spacing for each species and kind of just average that and then space your trees out. So if your nuts require 25-foot spacing and your fruit requires 15-foot spacing, you would just average that spacing out and then space your nuts and trees accordingly. But yeah, they grow really well together.
Cool, thank you.
Got time for maybe one more question. Miss Mel.
I know, going back to when you were talking about the foraging as that y'all did as a way of raising money. I know here at one of the farms at Patchwork, we did we do like a couple end of the season festivals. Like we have a herb patch, so we'll do some things with herbs, like showing people how to make tinctures, harvesting weeds or beneficial weeds, things like that, as a way to make money. Last year, a couple of years ago, before COVID closed everything down, we did like fermentation festivals. So yeah, we had a couple of people in doing that. We showed people how to do some canning and just different ways to ferment some foods. And I have an ongoing thing where I do like no food waste. Just try to show people how to utilize some of the end of season foods as a way to save money and just like do workshops like that as a way to bring in some postseason money to store up for next season as well too. So those are just some ideas just to generate some extra income too towards the end of the season. So
Yeah, those are such great ideas, and they're really fun too.
right.
You know, it's so much fun to have a fermentation festival. Like everyone would join that, and it is a really great way to diversify your income, like you said, and also to create some revenue in the off season. Because, like you said, you could do a canning workshop, or you know, after you're done with your harvest, you can have other types of festivals. You can do workshops in the greenhouse, preparing for the next season. You could do all sorts of things, but engaging the community is a great way to diversify your income. Yeah, those are some really fun festivals, Ms. Mel. I want to join.
Thanks.
Was there a question in the chat? Oh, no. Do we have any more time? I think we're at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, 7 o'clock here on the East Coast.
Oh,
so
7
we're-
o'clock. Oh my goodness.
Well,
7 o'clock. Well, I will say all these resources that I put in the PowerPoint, I'll give those to Andy and you guys can have access to all of that. But there are a lot of great resources specific to the Northeast. So if you do want to learn more about what crops grow well together and how you can kind of diversify your system in the Northeast, there are a lot of resources for that. And like you said, again, I'm always here. Yeah, good to meet you all.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And your contact information too is on the directory in Teachable. So if you want to get in touch with her, feel free to check there and either give her a call or email. And thanks so much for your time, Catherine. That was wonderful. All right, so we are at the top of the hour. And so just in closing, I just want to go over a couple logistics. And I see there's a few questions in the chat regarding arriving and also what farms we'll be visiting. So first and foremost, I just want to say starting tomorrow, please check your email. We'll be sending out lots of information and logistics starting tomorrow, but also over the course of the next several days. In terms of checking in, Robin, I don't know if you have an answer now, but if not, we will include that in the email regarding for those of you arriving Sunday. And Robin?
Generally it's 3 o'clock. I will double check though and have Andy put that in the email.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so those of you who put down you want to have a room for Sunday night, we'll include the check-in information. We do plan on starting around 8 o'clock Monday morning. We are to be at our first farm at 9, but we're gonna have a little get together beforehand, get to know each other before we get on the bus and head to our first farm. We have 6 amazing farms already lined up. And I want to mention too, this will be in the emails, but some of them have and are preparing some hands-on activities for us and opportunities for us to not only learn about their systems, but also as a way for us to sort of give back for their time for hosting us. So there are some activities. So nothing major, but you may want to bring some work boots, some gloves if you prefer to use them. But again, we'll include that in the emails. I do want to point out though that one of the farms is requesting that everyone sign a waiver. So I'm going to include that in tomorrow's email. If you can sign it and email it back to me, that would be great. For those of you who don't have access to a scanner, I will have hard copies with me when we are in person, but I just want everyone to know that one farm is requesting this. And so we do want to follow their rules and really appreciate their being a gracious host. I think you're going to really appreciate seeing this farm. So also for Wagon here, I will include the list of farms we will be seeing, so you can check it out beforehand. Other than that, we have, like I said, 6 farms, and on Monday evening, we have a reservation at Full Tilt Brewery, which is a brewery close by to where we're staying that does a great job buying from local farms in the area, and they're going to host us outside for a group dinner. And then Tuesday, we have 2 farms in the afternoon to visit, and the plan is to try and be back at the hotel for some closing components We hope to be done by about 4 o'clock. It may turn out to be more around 4:30, just depending on when we get back to the hotel and do some closing components. So I'd say between 4 and 5, we should definitely be done on Tuesday, and you can head on out. Otherwise, all I can just say is, continue to check your email. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. For those of you, which is almost everyone who have put down to have lodging, your name is on the list, so you can check in and should be all set to go. Any other last minute logistical questions regarding Baltimore?
Well, I already talked to you about mine, so that's separate.
Yeah, all good. Okay, so I'm going to put in the chat real quickly, if I can do this. I did just see next week, this is our last virtual session, so we are off next week with no office hours either. But I did see that Virginia Tech is hosting a webinar on urban agriculture. So I'm putting the link in the chat. I'm not sure if it is just specific to some of the research and programs available in Virginia, but I thought I would at least include this now. It looked like a pretty good program, so you can check it out, see if it's something you want to be a part of. It's on September 29th. All right. Other than that, appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully you've enjoyed these virtual sessions. As you know, they are recorded and all the information is in Teachable, all the recording links, as well as the presentations and all the additional worksheets and resources as well. You're going to be receiving a lot more resources when we see you in person. So be prepared to come home with quite a bit more. And it looks like the survey evaluation for tonight's session is in the chat. So if you can just take 2 minutes to fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. As always, I'll include it in tomorrow's email as well in case you don't get to it tonight, but your input is very valuable. So thank you for taking a few minutes to help us out. Otherwise, again, thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you in about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. Hopefully the weather cooperates because we got a great few days planned, and just look forward to meeting you in person and spending some time together. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out. And on that note, I hope you all have a wonderful evening.